2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
It's time to have a look at what's happening in the world of politics. We do that with Professor of Politics, Jim Jose. Good morning, Jim. Today
Good morning,
you want to touch on, firstly, let's touch on that very croaky voice of yours. It actually makes mine sound all right today. Look, we're touching on the term un-Australian. Now, I kind of feel I should have bought in, I've got one of those hats with the wide brim hats with the corks on it. I should have bought one of those in today. But since we're talking on things Australian. But you want to touch on Immigration Minister Peter Dutton, his comments on referring to lawyers defending refugees as being un-Australian. And let's take it from there.
Well, let's backtrack a fraction.
Sure.
Peter Dutton didn't use the word un-Australian. That was used by Alan Jones, who was interviewing him at the time. And Peter Dutton didn't disagree with him, but he used... and he went on to add a bit of detail around what Alan Jones was saying and certainly endorsed the sentiments. And what it seemed to amount to was that Peter Dutton was unhappy that a number of lawyers had given their services for free to asylum seekers to challenge interpretations or the government's position and to challenge the constitutional validity of that decision or those decisions around those particular asylum seekers. So he was basically saying, agreeing with Alan Jones, that it was un-Australian for these lawyers to provide their services for free to people who were trying to subvert a government decision or to have a government decision overturned.
So do you think that point on its own is the core of the argument that he's making? It's like, well, the government has made a decision, pretty much a long-standing decision, at least since the last couple of governments have been in on asylum seekers, etc. This is where we stand, and all of a sudden we've got these people in the legal minds trying to find this backdoor way to bore holes in it?
Well, there are 2 points I think that we need to think about here. One is that the Immigration Act is exceptionally complex, and even ordinary lawyers, and by that I mean lawyers who don't specialise in immigration law or constitutional law, find the Immigration Act exceptionally difficult to interpret and understand.
So why do we have a situation like that to begin with, or is that just welcome to the world of legislation?
Well, in part, yes, and the immigration area is an area that is constantly being amended and changed through administrative procedures. The minister has exceptional power. And part of the constitutional process and part of our political process, contrary to Alan Jones's views of being un-Australian, part of our political process is that governments and their ministers need to be and should be held to account. They should be acting within the constitutional rules of the game. Now, what Peter Dutton has apparently endorsed is that it seems to be inappropriate for experts in the field of immigration law or expert lawyers to give their services for free to people who have no knowledge of the law and how they should operate. In this particular case, it's asylum seekers. But I think the really scary bit here, and this goes to the second point that I was going to touch on here about the minister has exceptional power. For a minister of the Crown, the Minister for Immigration and Border Control has enormous discretionary power on a range of matters that don't need to be go before a court or the Parliament or whatever. So holding a minister to account, or at least expecting a minister to be held to account, is part of the Australian political process. It's certainly not un-Australian. It's certainly what every Australian, I think, would expect, that ministers of the Crown are accountable for their decisions and their actions. To muddy the waters or turn it around in the way that Alan Jones has and Peter Dutton has, to sort of say this is all un-Australian, it touches on a much bigger issue, Mark, and that issue is around, suppose it's not asylum seekers, suppose it's some other area of law and issue with a powerless group or number of people, individuals, who don't have the legal wherewithal or means to take on, the government and to hold it to account and to get its decisions scrutinised. What about those areas? And this is sort of what Peter Dutton is saying, is that, I'm a Minister of the Crown. I've made my decision, and therefore no one should challenge it.
I've got a thought, though. I think that if the lawyers were working in other fields, like you mentioned, others that may not have access to legal representation, like if he was going on behalf of some homeless people that had got themselves caught up in a legal situation, or maybe a lady that's left her partner in a domestic abuse situation and they were helping those people, I don't think it would have created any traction or any friction with anybody from the government. I think it's this single issue that is where most of the angst is.
I would probably disagree more broadly on that, because the point is that the minister is saying that my decision is being challenged by these high-powered lawyers who are making it their business to undermine my decision by. And in this particular case, it's asylum seekers who seem to be, an easy target for the government and/or shock jocks to go after, and we all say, "Oh yeah, no problem," but this has happened in other areas where ministers have had their decisions challenged, and they've used much the same sorts of reasoning that Peter Dutton's using, except not agreeing that it's un-Australian. What they've basically said is that they've been really annoyed that their decision has been challenged. And in part, that's what social justice and pro bono processes are all about, enabling people who don't have the power to be able to have their day in court or have their voice heard. And, it's okay for someone like Alan Jones. There's no problem with him seeking legal advice. There's plenty of money to support him in that. But asylum seekers, homeless people, they don't have that access.
Just one last question very, very quickly. Do you think there's perhaps community support on the minister in this, in that we go through this whole democratic process to put elected officials in? We say, yep, you're in charge of this portfolio, you're making the decisions, and we go through all this, and then one or two people just run off to the High Court and a couple of people make a decision that changes everything. I think people are a bit sick of that.
Well, if the minister's made the wrong decision or acted contrary to the constitutional law or contrary to the law of the land, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that's irrelevant. It's just simply that they've acted outside the boundaries of their power. If that's the case, then so be it. And I think most Australians will be happy to know, and it's a very Australian thing for Australians to talk back to power. At least that's part of our national image. Whether we actually do that in practice is another matter.
True.
But certainly ministers always complain when people talk back to them and contradict them. But, that's the nature of politics.
And hence why legislation is so complex to begin with.
Yes.
Good luck with all of that. Jim, thanks for your time with us.
Yeah, my pleasure,
we
Mark.
love having him in. It is Jim Jose talking politics with us this week, as usual, at 2NURFM 103.7.